My husband lost his job, and we ended up moving to a mobile home his parents own in the California desert where he grew up. After living my entire life in the liberal enclaves of PNW/N, Cali mountains and forests, an unexpected and unwanted move to a red zone where I knew literally no one besides my in-laws, who don't particularly like me, was highly stressful to say the least. Add to the situation that our 6-year-old was experiencing major culture shock and homesickness. I was about 4 months pregnant, and my husband was being a major tantrum. Just to give you an idea of the level of stress in the house. Oh, and did I mention we moved in the middle of July when temperatures were hovering around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and my father-in-law neglected to tell us that the AC in the house was broken, and there was no flooring in half the place? Yeah, waking nightmare. After about a month of the three of us living in my FIL's tiny study, the house is finally livable. It's located on the fringes of a tiny town that is about 45 minutes from the closest city. We have a truck stop gas station, a fire station, a corner store, and a smattering of houses. Our street dead ends at and is surrounded by BLM land and is tucked in between low hills / backs up to mountains. Half the other houses are uninhabited. My husband found work near his parents' house in the city. And since his parents were willing to help with childcare, our kiddos started school there as well. This left me at home alone with no car for long hours, which I secretly loved because it gave me time to unpack emotionally and physically, and also meant I had limited interaction with my in-laws. So I could enjoy being radiantly pregnant without jabs about how fat my face was getting. One day, about 3 weeks after we moved into the house, something felt off. I was sitting down in the living room, which has no windows to the front yard, and suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that I had to go let my dog in now, even though she'd only been outside for a few minutes. As I walked into the kitchen, I realized that it was eerily silent and still outside. Keep in mind, it was late August in the desert, so the windows and doors were all closed and the AC was on, so I'm not sure how I knew it was creepy outside before I opened the door to call in my dog, but somehow I did. Usually there's a breeze or bugs buzzing or hummingbirds hitting up the feeder on our deck, which had been the case when I let Doggo out. But when I opened up the sliding door to call for my dog, there was absolute silence. And when I looked out into the yard, I realized why. Sitting at our gate was a gigantic black dog. I don't just mean a big dog. The top of this dog's head was just below the top edge of our 8-foot chain link gate. It was easily as wide as a Mini Cooper, and looked like a cross between a Newfoundland and a grizzly bear. My dog is a Sharpie-Eye Pit Bull mix, and she only came to about mid-chest on this huge beast. She's sitting there, maybe 10 feet from it with just flimsy chain fence between them, watching it quietly. Tears immediately started pouring down my cheeks. I don't cry easily, and suddenly it felt like I was carrying 2 full-sized adults over my shoulders. It took every ounce of energy. I had to walk to the edge of our small deck. I tried to very quietly whistle for my dog, and nothing really came out, or if it did, it was swallowed by the silence. Still, right as I whistled, both my dog and the black dog turned their heads to look at me. My dog slowly stood up and calmly walked over to me. You have to understand, she is the derpiest, bounciest collection of happy, squish-faced love, and never does anything less than bound across the yard with her tail up, tongue out, and ears perked when she's called. So this was completely out of character. When she reached me, she turned and looked back at the black dog, then back at me, then started to walk back towards it like she wanted me to follow her. I made a lunge for her and grabbed her harness. The dog stood up and we locked eyes. I was then hit by the deepest sadness I've ever felt. Worse than when either of my parents died. It was like a cold wave crashed directly in the center of my heart. I was sobbing uncontrollably as I dragged my dog inside. When I looked back, the black dog had begun to walk down the street towards the mountains. It went behind a large Palo Verde shrub and disappeared. I sat on my kitchen floor sobbing and shivering for a good hour, despite the searing summer temps. I finally calmed down and worked up the nerve to take my dog out again later that afternoon. When I checked the area around the gate for paw prints, there were none, but there was a giant void in the sandy tire tracks my husband made when he left for work. My dog remained subdued for a while, but was back to herself by the time husband and kid got home. I didn't say anything to him. Things weren't really great between us and he was in a bad mood. But he noted later on how funny was that our dog kept pacing back and forth in front of the gate. About a week later, I went in for a prenatal appointment. I'd lost my baby. The doctor said it was a failure to thrive / nothing I could have done / sometimes these things happen situation. I'd been feeling off for about 2 weeks, but I just chalked it up to how stressful life had been. I honestly would have marked the black dog off as a stress-induced hallucination or something had my dog not interacted with it so extensively. About a month later, I was hiking on the south end of Joshua Tree with my husband. We turned around to follow a hawk that had flown overhead, and there on the trail we just walked was a big black dog. Not as big as the one at the house. This one was closer to the size of a normal Newfoundland. It sat down and, as funny as it sounds, sneezed, then got up and walked off. My husband tried to follow it, but lost it. The area we were hiking was all low plants. Nowhere for this dog to have come from or gone to without us seeing it for quite a while. Before it appeared, we'd been talking about our baby and had actually settled on a name for him, even though we'd never meet him. I guess you could see the black dog as something malicious or blame it for losing the pregnancy, but I don't. I think it came to escort the little soul I had on to its proper place in the universe. And it gives me great comfort to think of a little boy resting in the guard of a big, fluffy dog. My husband still thinks the one we saw while hiking was a stray, but whenever my dog meets someone new, she sneezes as a sort of "I'm friendly" gesture. I think the dog was letting me know that the little guy made it to where he needed to be safely. As a kid, I always loved being on the freeway. If we were on the road, it meant my family and I were going somewhere exciting, adventurous. Whether it was my uncle's country home in Sacramento or my other uncle's home in San Francisco, overlooking the bay, the memories I have had with my family and friends have been pleasant, to say the least, which is why I was always shocked when people wanted to visit my family and I in boring old Modesto. The town was boring. The fashion was lame, and all my cool cousins lived on the other stretch of the highway. Then one day, everything in our family changed. In just under 1 minute, our whole entire lives would change as we know it. Getting married at an early age and going back to my family's home country of the Fiji Islands was normal, if you can call it that, thing for most Indian girls in the 90s. It was common for an Indian girl to be set up with a compatible partner from her parents' hometown, and then married off to his family. At the age of 10, I didn't realize how vile this practice would come to be in later years. However, back then it was business as usual. One particular cousin, Sue, had done just that. At the tender age of 17, she agreed to marry a young man around the same age that she had never met before. Her lavish wedding took place in the Fiji Islands, and those family members that had more change in the bank than the rest of us attended the festivities overseas. My family is large, in the hundreds, but when we got that phone call one blistering night in winter, I never truly realized how losing 4 family members in one night would impact our family. One of them had just stepped out of a plane from the Fiji Islands and touched American soil that very day. He was to be our brother-in-law. We would never meet him. The accident on 132 late Saturday night was pure havoc. There were body parts scattered across the perimeter of the highway, a famous freeway known for her curvy roads and unforgiving blind spots. We will never know what caused Sue to slam the brakes on her new sports car. Later we would find she might have been showing off for her new husband, I get it girl, I get it, and slam into 2 other vehicles, catapulting nearly 3 feet in the air before crashing down in a fiery crash and terminating the lives of 7 people, including herself. My uncle, who answered the phone that night, was the only brave soul who went to identify the body of his sister, her husband, their teenage daughter Sue, and her new husband. He's never been the same since. because of the severe nature of the situation. Faces of Sue and her parents had to be resurrected, a request made by Sue's only brother, who demanded that his parents and his sister have an open casket, proper Indian funeral. Funeral homes never creep me out. As a matter of fact, I find comfort in sitting next to the dead. It reminds me of how lucky I am. As I sat in the pew, not yet quite ready to approach the 3 casket baskets that sat woefully in front of me, I had to mute out the anguished screams of the elders beside me. Indian weddings and funerals go hand in hand. The cries of the women are ungodly. Another brave, is brave the right word? Family members swung past me, holding a video camera. I couldn't believe it. Why were they taping this? To show other family members who couldn't attend, I was later told. The fact that a VHS tape exists still bothers me to this day. I wonder where the lost tapes could be. The 4th casket, you ask? The one with Sue's husband's body? Well, his family blamed Sue for their young son's untimely death and forbid his body to reside next to her for eternity. His body, after the investigation, was hauled back to the Fiji Islands for a private ceremony. I still to this day don't know his name. I couldn't help but think that my cousin had just gotten married, flew back to the United States on her own, waited for her husband for months to arrive, and when he did, she chose for my family to meet him first. Sue was beautiful, but as a cadaver, they made her into a human doll. Her face was polished to perfection, full of feature filler that made her look ravishing and glowing. Her lips were blood red in her hands, which looked awfully fake, had Lee press-on nails with tiny specks of glitter. She looked terrifyingly beautiful. Her parents that lay beside her were also primed for viewing. My uncle was missing his legs, and I couldn't help but think how hollow he looked. He was so full of life when I last saw him, and now he lay there in his casket, bare, devoid of most of his limbs, becoming this drying carcass waiting to be doted on by all the bleak mourners. My aunt's face was full of wrinkles and cracks, areas where the makeup had settled and begun to desiccate. Cameraman stoically zoomed past me as I despondently walked past the caskets, saying my final goodbyes to the sweet family. The dead don't really scare me. I fear the living far more. What I didn't mention about Sue was the clothes she had requested to be buried in. Her wedding clothes. If you know anything about Indian weddings, we go all out. Back then, the clothes weren't Sabyasachi style by no means, but all that glittered is gold, and Sue was glowing from inside her casket. Perhaps it was from all her wedding jewelry that was placed around. Her face. I miss Sue's Indian wedding in Fiji, but now, for the last time, I got to see her as an Indian bride. The problem isn't that my family died and went to heaven. The problem is they never left their home. Shortly after the funeral, when the house had settled and the guests began trickling in a little more slower and the nights got darker, the 3 of them began showing their presence slowly throughout the house. One day, I cornered Sue's brother, more out of morbid curiosity than anything, to ask him why there were so many priests being brought into the home lately. He told that the whispers, sounds of people talking, and the footsteps that just didn't stop. He would walk past Sue's room, in which the doors would remain closed, and he would hear the bed creaking, doors creaking, and the sound of footsteps descending in the room. When I asked him if it scared him, he replied that he was used to his sister getting ready every morning before she went to work. He found comfort in knowing she was still around. The priests were brought in because Sue's brother's wife was the one that was affected the most. She would wake up to lash marks on her face, the feeling of someone lying in bed next to her when no one was home, and the feeling of always being watched. Sue never liked her brother's wife. Her brother was divorced within that year. Sue's brother moved out of the house shortly after. The rumors began circulating. Family members came out of hiding. The stories came from different family members, those that have lived in Sue's house, those that have stayed the night, those visiting from overseas, those that rented rooms in the large home, now too big for just 2 people. Over the years, our ears were filled with tormenting recounts of Sue making sure her presence known. Of course, no one physically saw them, but they were there. next to their shadows when they walked, in the television reflection when it was switched off, in the rear view mirror when they least expected it. That brief reflection as they scurried past the sliding door, daring not to look to see who was following them that night. No one in our family could explain it, and some of them stopped talking about it. Years ago. Then there are those VHS tapes. It was the whispers that would eventually drive this family to sell their home and move out of the state. The hushed voice next to them while they tried to sleep. The whispers that would come late at night when the other one wasn't home. The whispers you would hear inside Sue's closed-door room. I suppose the saying is true, family is forever. In my first job out of college, I moved from a big city to rural coastal Louisiana to work for a newspaper. I'm talking an hour and a half south of New Orleans, deep in the swamp, alligators on the roads, old people still speaking French to each other, and the only way between towns was miles and miles of remote two-lane highways winding along bayous. Late one night, I was coming back from an assignment extra tired. I worked hard at my job, slept bad, and the stress was bone deep. I just wanted to get back to the office, finish my writing for the night, and go home. Bayou Sail Road would get me to my destination sooner, though I hated to take it at night. It wound in sharp corners through the open pitch-black marsh. No shoulder, no street lights, just a few skeletal trees and the open grassy water. I slowed down to a crawl to drive it. This was the end of the world, and no one was coming to get you if you made a mistake. But when I took one of the hard, blind corners, I had to slam on my brakes. There was an older man in the road, and he didn't flinch even when my brights caught him in their spotlight. I wondered if he was drunk and worried about what I should do. There were no houses around here, and he might be in some kind of trouble. I sat there with my foot on the brake, waiting for him to say something, some small, desperate tale like, "Thank God you came. I've been in an accident." Or, "My car broke down and I need a ride into town." But he was as still and quiet as I was, and we only stared blankly at each other waiting for the other to make a move. "You could just leave, you know." A small part of me said, "You're a woman and you're alone. No one would blame you." The only way past him on the narrow road would be to pass him so closely he could have reached out and touched my car door. I cracked my window and asked if he needed some help. He only looked at me. I started to feel a creeping panic, my body responding to the idea that something was wrong. "Fuck this," it screamed. "Not now. Not today. I'll call someone," I told him finally, and rolled my window up firmly, checked the door locks, and took off around him. He didn't waver from his spot in the road, even as I hit the gas, and carefully dipped around him, crunching on the narrow gravel shoulder. One quick turn, and he disappeared behind me in the marsh. I was spooked, so I drove fast and didn't stop and waited until I finally saw the first lit-up signs of civilization, a gas station and convenience store, to get out of my car to call the cops in the presence of other people. The clerk listened silently while I reeled off my story on the phone to an officer who promised to drive down there and look for the man after taking my information. When finally hung up, she said, "You were down there on Bayou Sail?" "Yeah," I said. "He was alone?" "No car." "Yeah," I said. "I have no idea how he got out there. There was nothing." "He asked you for a ride?" she said. "No," I said. "You offered to give him one?" she said. "Great," I thought. Now she thinks I'm some kind of asshole. "No," I said. "But good," she said, "because that probably wasn't no man this time of night." The road, she said, was haunted by spirits who would often try to catch tourists, people who didn't know any better. And if you agreed to pick the spirit up, he could ask for another favor, usually your soul, she said. I nodded gravely at the woman, but laughed hysterically to myself when I finally got back into my car, still shaking a bit with adrenaline and fear. What a stupid thing to get taken in by. The hitchhiking ghost was a classic kid's campfire story. I had more to fear from any living man than a dead man. When I still couldn't shake the creeps the next day, I called the cops back to see if they'd ever picked someone up. Sure, he'd just been some old drunk. They drove the road several times, the cops said. There was no one,